Very excited to be here. Thank you all, everyone at the SOF, for having me. There's so much I could say about the Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship, but I can't for the sake of time. But just know that there are so many of you that I have been greatly enriched by your presentations and lectures and books. So thank you again for having me. I'm going to jump right into it. So what we're going to be discussing is the moral and spiritual vision of Edward de Vere. And there's a quote that is sort of a theme, in a sense, that's going to be overshadowing this whole presentation. Whoever wants to become a Christian must first become a poet. And this is from St. Porphyrios. St. Porphyrios reposed in the early 1990s, but he was sort of encapsulating here the ethos of the Christian East and the poetic nature and theology in which they view the world. So in this presentation, we're going to take a closer look at the spiritual influences of Edward de Vere and their presence in the works of Shakespeare. With de Vere's depth of knowledge, multilingual capabilities, and historical interests, all of which transcended his cultural milieu, what other religious traditions might have inspired the 17th Earl of Oxford? Many have stated, including J. Thomas Looney, that the works of Shakespeare transcend the 16th century Protestant Catholic struggle, with striking moments of spiritual insight, oftentimes offering a more poetical and mystical expression of faith than what was readily accessible in England at that time. How did this occur? How did Edward de Vere avoid becoming a slave to the spirit of the age? We will look closely at neglected passages from Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, along with de Vere's Bedingfield Letter, and how these works express a spiritual ethos much aligned not only with the works of Shakespeare, but also with Eastern Christian thought. In other words, within Christendom, the world in which Edward de Vere lived and wrote, there is a third door to consider which has been neglected within the realm of the authorship question. Oftentimes, significant realities remain unnoticed simply because we don't know what we're looking for. In 1920, the author of Shakespeare Identified, J. Thomas Looney, suggests that it is therefore as we approach the highest triumphs of his genius, which represent the whole, that his work becomes a special or synoptic self-revelation. This, however, pertains to the inward and spiritual life rather than to its external forms. The working out of this department of Shakespearean inquiry belongs largely to the future. And this is precisely what we are attempting to do, inquire about the inner life of the great poet and dramatist with questions about virtue, conscience, beauty, faith, spirituality, and the most visceral elements of his psyche. But this poses a more fundamental question. Is this a worthy endeavor? Another question, is it even possible? Should we ignore what Edward de Vere divulges about sacred convictions? Curiously, there is, at times, especially in our modern world, a tendency to avoid the topic, to throw it off to one side and say, well, everyone was religious in those days, so it doesn't really matter that much. But I would argue the exact opposite. I would say that it matters even more. The people of his day cared more deeply about spiritual matters than most of us living today. And we learned from Edward de Vere's letters and poetry and annotations in his Geneva Bible how personal his feelings and convictions were. But before we get into the essence of Eastern Christian thought and its relationship to Edward de Vere as Shakespeare, it would behoove us to make a few brief comments about the centrality of the Bible in Shakespeare. Victor Hugo said, England has two books, the Bible and Shakespeare. England made Shakespeare, but the Bible made England. In other words, there would be no Shakespeare without the Bible. Hannibal Hamlin, a Stratfordian, in his book, The Bible in Shakespeare, has this to say. All of Shakespeare's plays regularly allude to other works, yet no book is alluded to more thoroughly, or with more complexity and significance than the Bible. The explanation for this is simple. The Bible was the most important and most widely known book in Shakespeare's culture. In truth, knowledge of the Bible is necessary to fully understand Shakespeare's plays. Hamlin goes on to say, Shakespeare's familiarity with the Bible was extensive. There is no biblical book, including the Apocrypha, to which he does not allude. However, he was particularly drawn to certain books. This is why Professor Roger Strittmatter's dissertation on Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible is such an important and groundbreaking work. For centuries, we could find the Bible in the works of Shakespeare, if we wanted to. We could look at the works of Shakespeare and we could find the Bible. But now, thanks to Professor Strittmatter's scholarship, we could also begin to see for the first time Shakespeare in the Bible, so to speak. We could see his annotations, his underlinings. So, the Bible is absolutely central. However, that's not what this presentation is ultimately about. The reason for this is that although the Bible is central to any Christian culture or civilization, it is the interpretation of the Bible that ultimately leads to the varying traditions within Christendom. Through what lens is one reading the Scriptures? Through a Roman Catholic lens or a Calvinist lens or something else altogether? The soul of the age transcends the age. Edward de Vere had a front seat to the most intense Catholic-Protestant debates in the land. England was a religious tinderbox at this time. Intense, dangerous, and radical movements were developing on both sides at rapid speed. At one point, 7 bills were proposed in Parliament to move the state into much closer alignment with Geneva, introducing more extreme policies against the Catholics of the realm. Bernard M. Ward helps us understand this dynamic when he says, although Lord Oxford took no part other than in the ceremonial of this Parliament, the speeches and proceedings which he listened to and voted on form part of the framework in which his life must be set. He was witnessing the opening scenes of the great struggle that finally culminated in the Civil War and the Puritan Revolution. In other words, the zeitgeist was screaming, pick a side, us or them. There are no other options. Was he searching for a third door, at some point in his life anyway, amidst the violence and vitriol of the 16th century England? Looney put it this way: Protestant sectarianism was as contrary to his outlook upon life as it is to the wide genius of Shakespeare. On the other hand, we cannot say confidently of Edward de Vere any more than we can of Shakespeare that he was an Orthodox Roman Catholic. It is much more likely that his was the Catholicism of a universal humanity with large discourse looking before and after, taking into itself the culture of Greece and Rome on the one hand, and on the other, the visions that belong to a prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come. What does this mean? That de Vere was looking before and after the Catholicism of his day. Of course, this could simply mean that he possessed an intuitive prophetic mind. But in addition to this, with the extent of his education, one must wonder what exposure he had to the Eastern Fathers of Christianity. Significantly, on December 24, 1581, a religious work of St. John Chrysostom upon the Epistle to the Ephesians was published and dedicated to Anne Oxford. St. John Chrysostom is one of the most revered fathers of Greek Orthodox Christianity. De Vere's knowledge of ancient Greek would have made it possible for him to become acquainted not only with the Greek philosophers and pagan literature, but also the Greek fathers of Christianity, even those not yet translated into English. The dedication of Chrysostom is evidence that de Vere and his wife Anne had some familiarity, at least, with Eastern Christian thought. In addition to this, and I was really amazed to discover this, while living in Venice, de Vere attended the Greek Orthodox Church and actually sent a Greek New Testament to his wife Anne as a gift. To this day, the Divine Liturgy, the most important liturgical service in the Eastern Orthodox Church is referred to as the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And he was given the name Chrysostom, which means golden-mouthed, because of his eloquence of speech and divine gift of oration. How might this historical figure have appealed to the poet who was to pen the works of Shakespeare? Well, one way or another, Shakespeare was viewing the world with a broader lens than his contemporaries, and this lens happens to share greater clarity of vision with an earlier Christian ethos. Strip Matter confirms this when he says, Hamlet thinks syncretically, reconciling rather than banishing paradox, reconciling rather than banishing paradox, is central to the Greek patristic ethos. We know the significance of Calvin's influence on 16th century England, but this mountain of evidence makes it more astounding how lacking the works of Shakespeare are in polemical Protestant propaganda. One would have to make a conscious decision to express spiritual truths that are more timeless and universal than those of the Elizabethan zeitgeist. Again, Bernard M. Ward confirms this when he says, in a word, the movements represented by Machiavelli and Calvin did not interest him at all. And although later on he was destined to feel some sympathy for the old form of religion which had been in vogue during his youth, Roman Catholicism, it was to Balthasar Castiglione that his heart really went out. And we'll come to the courtier and the moral and spiritual vision in the courtier soon. Artists are born with a peculiar intuitiveness, a strange sensitivity to the world around them. They often sense and feel when something is discordant before the rest of society begins to see the consequences. Again, Edward de Vere was at the center of power in 16th century England. He was witnessing the radical revolutionary changes taking place all around him with a prodigious knowledge of history. So you just imagine this poetic and prophetic soul was living through violent times with the intuitive wisdom to recognize evil and corruption, but also the historical knowledge to observe the changing tides with watchfulness and divine prudence. With the depth of education that Oxford had, what insights lay behind Ulysses' observation in Troilus and Cressida as it relates not simply to political power, but also to religious fidelity to truth. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere repugnancy, then everything includes itself in power. Power into will, will into appetite, and appetite and universal wolf. So, doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce and universal prey, and last eat up itself. So on one side there was the consolidation of power in the papacy, unrecognized not only by the Protestants, but also by the Christian East. And on the other side, the tyrannical state with the king or queen, not only as head of state, but now also head of the church. So where is the ancient voice of beauty and harmony amidst this advancing universal wolf? And this brings us back to the opening quote. Whoever wants to become a Christian must first become a poet. It's not difficult to imagine how this ethos would resonate with the mind who wrote the works of Shakespeare. There is an ease and comfort that poets have with paradox and mystery. Poetry, by its very nature, is foreign to ideologies and extremes. The presence of ideology, propaganda, or polemics frightens poetry, as a deer in the forest is alarmed by intruders. In All's Well That Ends Well, the second Lord expresses the paradox inherent in our lives. The web of our life is a mingled yarn, good and ill together. Our virtues would be proud if our faults whipped them not, and our crimes would despair if they were not cherished by our virtues. Now, this is just one small example, but I would say the entire canon of Shakespeare really is a revelation of poetry, mystery, and paradox. Father Maximus Constus, an Eastern Orthodox monk of Mount Athos, in his book, The Art of Seeing, provides a striking illustration of the embracing of paradox embedded in ancient Christianity. And he does this by observing a 6th century icon of Christ, known as the Pantocrator, from St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. So this is 6th century. A great theological mystery is staring us right in the face. This is a poetic image of the God-man. Paradoxically, he has two natures. He is fully God and fully man. His two eyes represent the paradox of mercy and judgment, grace and truth. If we accept one without the other, we have substituted divine poetry for human reasoning. We have embraced ideology over revelation. So if you take either side of this image and mirror it, this is what you get. We lose the poetry, the beauty, the paradox, and the mystery of this face. Now for the historical context. A timeline of church history. And this is very fascinating because this is the timeline of church history from an Eastern perspective. For the first 1,000 years, as you can see, East and West were in union with each other. However, over time, serious variances began to threaten this communion. Historians tend to mark this great schism around the year of 1054. From this time on, the Eastern Christian tradition maintained an essentially different ethos and character from the West, whereas the Roman Catholic Church became more militaristic. You can even see within 50 years of the schism, the Crusades begin, and then the Inquisitions, and then the Protestant Reformation, and all the wars of religion. So there was a lot that happened after that. But the Roman Church became more militaristic, juridical, systematic, and punitive. The Greek East maintained a more Semitic, experiential, therapeutic, and paradoxical vision of Christ and the church. These are, of course, generalizations, but nevertheless, they bear significant truth. For centuries, Western religious thought had been moving in the direction of dualism and rationalism, leaving behind an earlier vision universally upheld by the first millennium. Mystery, poetry, and paradox of the first millennium was being slowly forsaken and replaced by other influences, such as the pagan Franks and Normans and Germanic tribes, who by converting to Christianity in many ways influenced Western Christianity as much as Christianity influenced them. So we have to imagine this, that people living in the West during these, post-1054 for the next however many centuries here, they're still thirsting for mystery, almost like an echo, a memory. But instead, they were offered superstitions to quench this desire. Mystery was upheld in the West as a weapon of power, while the ancient poetic purpose of mystery as an experience of man's humility was fading. De Vere's obsession with Italy was most likely rooted in an experience with beauty, mystery, poetry, paradox. All of these were still being upheld and lauded in the Roman Church to varying degrees, even though this ideal of beauty was also becoming tragically mixed with a vision of power, military might, guilt, fear of punishment, since the Great Schism of 1054. In many ways, the rise of humanism and the Renaissance were attempts to recover the vision of paradise rooted in ancient Christianity. As John Strickland suggests in Paradise and Utopia, the rise and fall of what the West once was. I would highly recommend this history series. It's a 4-volume series, and it's unique in that it explores the history of the West from an Eastern Christian perspective. The renowned historian John Julius Norwich, in his book Byzantium, the early years, has this to say: "Our civilization has never adequately acknowledged the debt it owes to the empire of the East." He also said, "There is a conspiracy of silence in the West around the Byzantine Empire, and this would obviously include its spiritual inheritance. One could almost say an unlifted shadow lies over the memory of the Christian East." Paradise and utopia is a valiant effort to begin lifting that shadow. But for those who were uniquely educated, such as Edward de Vere, what did he know of this ancient vision? So I want to touch on three significant differences in the ethos between the East and West: apophatic theology, anthropological optimism, and ontological metamorphosis. A simpler way to say this would be mystery, beauty, and immortality. So the first, mystery. After the Great Schism in 1054, the West began to strive to define mysteries of the faith systematically. Thomas Aquinas' famous work, Summa Theologica, is foundational to the West's pursuit of a rationalistic and systematic approach to theology. This new science was beginning to replace an ancient poetry. Systematic theology never occurred in the East. Greek Orthodox Christianity maintained an earlier patristic apophatic vision. What does that mean, apophatic? So apophatic theology, in essence, means negative theology. We begin by confessing what we don't know. Man, in this perspective, in this vision, is dependent on revelation and experience, not rationalistic or abstract concepts. Faith is an encounter, not an idea. And this orientation allows man to remain in a spirit of humility and wonder as he increases in knowledge and experience. A beautiful and timeless articulation of apophatic theology in the face of growing rationalism in the West comes to us actually from Shakespeare himself. In All's Well That Ends Well, LeFew says this: "They say miracles are past, and we have our philosophical persons to make modern and familiar things supernatural and causeless. Hence it is that we make trifles of terrors, ensconcing ourselves into seeming knowledge when we should submit ourselves to an unknown fear." That's apophatic. That's mystery. A poet such as Edward de Vere would struggle mightily to embrace such reductionism and rationalism found in Aquinas and the Reformers. Did he feel more akin to the poetic fathers of the Greek East, and indeed all of the first millennium fathers, when he encountered them? Would he have reacted to the rationalistic, reductionist dualisms of his day with the words, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy"? So after mystery comes beauty. Again, shortly following the Great Schism in the 11th century, a spirit of pessimism began to permeate the West. The first example I'd like to share with you on this comes from Pope Innocent III in the late 12th or early 13th century. It's a bit long, but it's important, so stay with me here. So Pope Innocent III says, "Man has been formed of dust, clay, ashes, and a thing far more vile, a filthy sperm. Man has been conceived in the desire of the flesh, in the heat of sensual lust, in the foul stench of wantonness. He was born to labor, to fear, to sufferings, and most miserable of all, to death. His evil doings offend God, offend his neighbor, offend himself. He defiles his good name, contaminates his person, violates his conscience through his shameful acts. His vanity prompts him to neglect what is most important, most necessary, and most useful. Accordingly, he is destined to become the fuel of the everlasting, eternally painful hellfire, the food of ferocious, consuming worms. His destiny is to be a putrid mass that eternally emits a horrible stench." Imagine your entire world, the head of your church coming from the Pope, is this pessimism just coming over. Imagine what was happening here. And the interesting thing is, even though the Protestant reformers were obviously protesting so much of what was going on in the Catholic Church, they not only maintained this pessimistic worldview, but took it even further. The second example I'd like to share with you is from Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians, where he says, again, sorry it's long, "All that is in this world is subject to the devil's malice, for he reigns over the entire world. This is why the world is also called the devil's kingdom." No matter how many people there may be in the world, they are all subject to sin and to the devil. They are all the devil's subjects, for his tyranny holds all men captive. When Christ is absent, then the evil world and the devil's kingdom are present. All spiritual and bodily gifts you profess, be they wisdom, justice, holiness, eloquence, power, beauty, or riches, are therefore but the instruments and slavish weapons of the devil's infernal tyranny. These he uses to make you serve him, to promote his reign, and to increase his power. Now, if you were hoping to maybe get a little less pessimism from John Calvin, you would be very disappointed. John Calvin just comes into the chorus and says, original sin is an hereditary pravity and corruption of our nature, diffused through all the parts of our soul, rendering us obnoxious to the divine wrath. Therefore, infants themselves, as they bring their condemnation into the world with them, are rendered obnoxious to punishment by their own sinfulness, not by the sinfulness of another. Their whole nature is, as it were, a seed of sin, and therefore cannot be but odious and abominable to God. This depravity never ceases in us, but is perpetually producing new fruits. For our nature is not only destitute of all good, but is so fertile in all evils that it cannot remain inactive. So, this pessimism that was sweeping over the West, particularly after the Great Schism, made its way into art. You really don't find images like this in the East. This is something, there was John Strickland calls it Stavrocentrism. There was an incredible monovision on the punitive suffering of Christ on the cross, which brought a lot of gore. It was very morbid. Hans Holbein's Dead Christ, there's a famous passage in Dostoevsky's The Idiot where Prince Mishkin is actually standing before this very painting. And he's a very innocent soul. He was almost a Christ-like figure in Dostoevsky's mind. So Prince Mishkin sees this painting, and he says, this could make someone lose their faith. And I would say that I think many people in the West have lost their faith because of this kind of, incredible pessimism and sort of just focus on death. You see the difference in a lot of iconography around the crucifixion. It became much more morbid and gory, whereas the Byzantine icon acknowledges the suffering of Christ, but there's still this kind of transcendent, almost maybe peace or serenity or something like that going on there. The theological vision of the East was articulated by the great novelist, speaking of Dostoevsky, who was himself an Eastern Orthodox Christian. His famous saying, again, we're talking about beauty will save the world. A very different view than what we heard from Pope Innocent III and those reformers. This vision is shot through with color and light. It's more of a vision of paradise. Again, this is sort of more of a first millennium. Throughout the centuries, these visual aids to prayer and contemplation have been referred to as windows into heaven. Okay, so this brings us to Castiglione and the Book of the Courtier, a central influence in the thought and inspiration of Edward de Vere. I know all of you know this. De Vere wrote the preface to Bartholomew Clerk's Latin translation in 1572. And yes, this is a holistic work, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on the spiritual vision expressed in the Courtier. But first, it's important to note what Edward de Vere thought about this work. So de Vere himself says, for what more difficult, more noble, or more magnificent task has anyone ever undertaken than our author Castiglione, who has drawn for us the figure and model of a courtier, a work to which nothing can be added, in which there is no redundant word, a portrait which we shall recognize as that of the highest and most perfect type of man. The vision of the courtier is steeped in an early patristic ethos and expresses a theological revelation in striking harmony with the Greek fathers of Christianity. And note the difference in tone from the pessimism of what we just heard a few minutes ago. Castiglione proclaims, "I say that beauty springs from God and is like a circle, the center of which is goodness. And so, just as one cannot have a circle without a center, so one cannot have beauty without goodness. A puritanical ethos views beauty with suspicion for fear of dishonorable passions, but Castiglione sees lower beauty as a potential wooing of the soul towards higher beauty. We are to be wary of idolatry, making an idol out of lower beauties, but we are not to be wary of beauty itself, for its source is the Creator. Castiglione continues to rhapsodize. What sweet flame, what ravishing fire must we believe that to be which springs from the source of supreme and true beauty, the fountain of all other beauty, which never increases or diminishes, always beautiful, most simple of itself, and equally in all its parts, like only to itself, and sharing in nothing other than itself. It is yet so beautiful that all other beautiful things derive their beauty from it, and this is the beauty indistinguishable from the highest good, which by its light calls and draws all things to it. What blessed awe must we think is that which possesses the soul when it attains the vision of divine beauty. The Eastern Orthodox hymn, Glory to God for All Things, expresses the same ethos regarding the holistic sacramental mystery of beauty. In it says, all true beauty has the power to draw the soul towards you and make it sing in ecstasy. Alleluia. So this brings us to de Vere's Bedingfield letter, which was included as a preface to Thomas Bedingfield's translation of Cardanus' Comfort in 1573. And we glimpse additional insight into Oxford's spiritual vision. He claims that many will profit from this work, which shall comfort the afflicted, confirm the doubtful, encourage the coward, and lift up base-minded man to achieve to any true sum or grade of virtue, whereto ought only the noble thoughts of men to be inclined. And because next to the sacred letters of divinity, nothing doth persuade the same more than philosophy, of which your book is plentifully stored. Could there be a higher purpose, a higher spiritual purpose in the mind of a writer or poet than for his or her works to comfort the afflicted, confirm the doubtful, encourage the coward, lift up the base-minded man to achieve to any true sum or grade of virtue? Is this letter not revealing the innermost ideals and ethics of the man who was Shakespeare? De Vere continues by saying that every man should follow the virtuous path, seeking to illustre himself with ornaments of virtue and to be furnished in mind with glittering virtues. For when all things else shall forsake us, virtue will ever abide with us, De Vere says. And when our bodies fall into the bowels of the earth, yet that shall mount with our minds into the highest heaven. According to De Vere, not even death can destroy virtue. It has the substance of eternity in it. A truly virtuous man undergoes an ontological transformation beyond that of mere behavior modification or outward religiosity. His entire being is imbued with divine energy to the extent that although his body fall into the bowels of the earth, his mind, his psyche, his being will ascend to the highest heaven. Do such men or women exist in this world who possess these heavenly virtues? If they do, according to Hamlet, they are to be treasured in this world of vanity. Give me that man that is not passion's slave, and I will wear him in my heart's core, in my heart of heart, as I do thee. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The more one researches, the more astonishing it becomes how the essence and spirit and moral vision of Edward de Vere and the works of Shakespeare are one. The consistency of de Vere's spiritual vision is seen again in a letter he wrote to his wife, Anne. In it, he says, "Cause your mind always to be aflame with love of truth, always a lover of truth. Let these be your true words, which so that you are more able to fulfill it, you require that the true author shall instruct you in holy writ, that his spirit may nourish thee inwardly, so that thus easing the true yearnings of your dear husband, you may be called true, the true glory of your true husband." Turning back to Castiglione, where he continues his symphony of divine beauty and sacred love. And remember, de Vere said this is the highest and most perfect portrait of a man. O most sacred love, what tongue is there that can praise you worthily, full of beauty, goodness, and wisdom? You flow from the union of beauty, goodness, and divine wisdom. There you dwell, and through it you return to it perpetually. Mystery, beauty, and now turning to immortality or ontological metamorphosis. St. Gregory of Palamas, an Eastern church father of the 14th century, defended the ancient, tradition or experience, nowadays is known as Hesychism. But in essence, what it was affirming that it is actually possible for man to partake of the divine nature. It's something that the Eastern Christian fathers call theosis, sometimes deification, but theosis is probably a little better. So in 2 Peter, for instance, you read this. I'm going to condense it for time. Knowledge of him who has called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature. Back to Castiglione, how does that relate? He says, accept the sacrifice of our souls and burn them in the living flame that consumes all earthly dross, so that wholly freed from the body they may unite with divine beauty in a sweet and perpetual bond, and that we, liberated from our own selves like true lovers, can be transformed into the object of our love and soar above the earth to join the feast of angels, where with ambrosia and immortal nectar for our food we may at last die a most happy death in life, as those ancient fathers whose souls by the searing power of contemplation you ravished from their bodies to unite with God. Saint Simeon, the new theologian, he died a few decades before the Great Schism, revered saint in the East, has this to say, in striking harmony with Castiglione. If you have not discerned that the eye of your mind has been opened, and that it has seen the light, if you have not perceived the sweetness of the Godhead, if you have not been personally enlightened by the Holy Spirit, if you have not sensed that your heart has been cleansed and has shone with luminous reflections, if, contrary to all expectation, you have not discovered the Christ within yourself, if you have not been stupefied at your vision of the divine beauty, and have not become oblivious of human nature when you saw yourself so totally transfigured, then tell me, how is it that you dare to make any statement at all about God? Now, the reference to seeing oneself totally transfigured is referring to the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor. St. Gregory of Palamas saw this as a vision of the uncreated light. So there is a tradition of transfiguration that goes all the way back to Adam, all the way to the Old Testament. Moses, after receiving the tablets of the law, it says he came down, his face shone like the sun. His face was transfigured. Christ, as I mentioned before, on Mount Tabor is transfigured before three of the apostles, Moses and Elijah, appear. And then also in the lives of the saints, Saint Seraphim and Seraph, as many others have, it has been said that they were transfigured into light. An interesting note about this is that no Eastern Christian saint has ever experienced the phenomena of the stigmata, which is just interesting to me. But they are consistently, throughout the centuries, said to have been transfigured into light. So that's just kind of a fascinating difference. So within this revelation is Psalm 82:6. I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. This was so important. Apparently, Christ himself repeated it. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I said, ye are gods? And then we fast forward to the 4th century, St. Athanasius the Great, his famous saying, God became man so that we might become God. In Shakespeare's Pericles, we have this very kind of interesting statement where he says, virtue and cunning here apparently means learning, at least the research I did. Virtue and cunning were endowments greater than nobleness and riches. Careless heirs may the two latter darken and expend, but immortality attends the former, making a man a god. And finally, the last thing I want to touch on is this incredible statement from de Vere in Latin. Roger, you'll have to make sure I'm pronouncing this correctly. Is it fini coronat opus? Is that right? Okay. I first learned about this in Roger's dissertation. And he makes the point that this phrase appears in Shakespeare's canon at least 4 times with slight variations. It was obviously very important to de Vere. The end crowns the work. And so I'm closing with this sense of paradox again, because what you have in the writings of de Vere, I didn't have time to get into his poetry, obviously, but in his letters, poetry, and the works of Shakespeare is the two extremes. You have this paradoxical reality of glimpsing the divine light on one hand, and then on the other hand, staring into the abyss. Hamlet is, in many ways, a meditation on mortality. Shakespeare could be said to be the prophet of the remembrance of death. So what is the end? Well, is it not our death? No athlete is crowned in the middle of a competition. It is only after the game is played that a champion is crowned. It is only after the battle that a warrior is honored. Our death is the end which crowns the work of our lives, the suffering, the struggles, the repentance, the totality of sacrifice of the spiritual warrior, according to de Vere, is only crowned at his or her death. What did Christ say when he was on the cross like the ultimate suffering artist? He says, "It is finished. It is crowned. It is completed. It is done." The end crowns the work, nothing else. And so the moral and spiritual vision of Edward de Vere would implore us to look forward to our Passover, our coronation, as it were, when all the sacrifices and struggles and repentance in our lifetime will be fulfilled by the grace of God and crowned in that moment when the fight is finally over, the game has been played, and the work has been accomplished. These are convictions that no man embraces frivolously. They would have to be bolstered by a genuine belief in divine mercy and providence. Professor Strittmatter draws our attention to Ecclesiasticus 11:27, which is underlined in de Vere's Geneva Bible. In the end, a man's works are discovered. Imagine the poignancy of this scripture if you are Edward de Vere. This was the vision of Edward de Vere. The end crowns the work. This world is passing, transient, fleeting. All will not be made right in this life, but in the world to come, at the dread judgment when the books will be opened and every secret laid bare, then the prophetic soul of the wide world will at last receive his consummation, and those who have labored in the mercy of God will receive their crowns and be adorned with ornaments of virtue, beauty, poetry, paradox, mystery, metamorphosis. The most ancient Christian vision is one of healing and transfiguration. Many things were changing in 16th century England, but according to Edward de Vere, one thing that would never change is the truth. For nothing is truer than truth. After all, he said, "But I hope truth is subject to no prescription, for truth is truth, though never so old, and time cannot make that false which once was true." Thank you.